Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 85 of war in Ukraine, and this is the second week of October 2023. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about that Bakhmut is not the epicenter of severe fighting anymore. Russians started an intensive offensive campaign in Avdiivka village. We're going to talk about how the war in Israel changed the dynamics of the war in Ukraine. And we will talk about Ukraine is changing its strategy and moving toward its weapon production. So, the severe fighting moved from Bakhmut to Avdiivka. Avdiivka is strategically important village in the middle of the Donetsk region. Russians have intensified their actions. The specific tactical situation in this area is not directly related to Ramstein meeting or the actions of the US or Israel. What is happening now is primarily associated with tactics and logic of the Russian military operations. They see that our offensive operations both in the Zaporizhia direction and in the Bakhmut direction, in the area of Avdiivka, Klishivka, and other villages are gradually being exhausted. The Russians want to take advantage of the situation. They try to strike at those places where the operational situation allowed them to attack. The proximity of Marinka village and Avdiivka village to Donetsk allows the Russians to transfer a large number of reserves. They can concentrate significantly a huge amount of artillery barrels there as well. And so they tried to achieve particular tactical successes. They needed some kind of victory because they haven't been very successful with that lately. If you look at the map of hostilities, Marinka and Avdiivka villages are the most convenient places for them. The situation of the Avdiivka region is getting very complicated. The Russians have been preparing to attack this settlement for a very long time. Throughout accumulated an insane number of troops, armored vehicles, aviation, artillery, and most importantly, artillery shells. Now they have put all this into action, and let's find out what is happening there. So Avdiivka village is a northwestern suburb of Donetsk city, which is occupied and it occupies a strategically important position. From this position, you can control the entire regional center, all of Donetsk. This in turn doesn't allow the Russians to use Donetsk in full, because Donetsk is being shot at from Avdiivka along and across. Avdiivka is, among other things, is a bridgehead for the future liberation of Donetsk. In general, Avdiivka village has been a bone in the throat of the occupiers for a very long time. They wanted to capture the settlement in 2014, if you remember, after the annexation of Crimea in the eastern regions of Ukraine. Because of this, Avdiivka probably survived dozens of large and small assaults. Gradually, the Ukrainian troops turned Avdiivka into a real fortress, which is very difficult to take. The Avdiivka coke plant plays an essential role in defending the settlement. There are thick reinforcement concrete walls, many underground communications, and various premises. Initially, it was built as a fortress. The plant is like, if you remember, Azov Stalin Mariupol, maybe even better. Avdiivsky Terikon rises near the coke plant. What you would ask, what Avdiivsky Terikon? This is an artificial hill made of spent rock. This hill became a critical height, strengthened by such a Ukrainian position from where the entire district can be seen. From those heights, you can see what the Russians plan and where and how. Last year, Russians managed to take Avdiivka settlement into the semicircle. From the north, south, and the east, they took Avdiivka in a semicircle, but they couldn't advance any further, and nothing helped them. Then, Ukrainians simply built an excellent fortification. Highly motivated soldiers sit in these fortifications, no matter what the Russians do or how they organize the forays and attacks, they cannot do anything. They cannot advance. But now they still decided that the perfect moment had come to solve this problem. Since the world is currently engaged in the war in the Middle East, Ukraine has spent a lot of energy on the offensive in the south, in the Zaporizhia region. The Russians have managed to fix the logistics in Donetsk, and the most important thing, of course, is that Putin will run for president again. Before that, he needs what in Russia is called a landmark victory. And Putin wants to announce that he will lead the Russian Federation on such a major note in the next 6 years. Well, in general, an offensive plan was developed in Moscow. By the way, it's not the stupidest, quite a reasonable plan, and he envisaged an attack not on Avdiivka itself, but on its flanks with an approach to the rear. The Russians planned to strike from the north and the south. Their task was not to storm this fortress, which is impregnable, but to surround this fortress and besiege it, keep it under siege until it surrenders. This is the way they did in Mariupol in 2022 when Ukrainian forces held the Mariupol Azov plant for several months and had no choice but surrender due to lack of supplies and food. Everyone knew the Russians were gathering a large army next to Avdiivka. Of course, the Ukrainians had mined everything there in advance. Ukraine artillery fired at roads, intersections, some buildings where the advancing forces could be located, and so on. All important objects were taken under fire control. All communications in the district near Avdiivka were taken under fire control long time ago because, as I said a little above, Avdiivka has been stormed many times already, and those who are storming always go for plus or minus the same thing road. That is, when the assault begins, the Ukrainian gunners, they're probably already with their eyes closed. Now, where to shoot? Because you will hit either a tank or a group of infantry. Well, when the Russians went forward, the bridges immediately exploded in front of them and behind them. The equipment ran into minefields and exploded. The Ukrainians heavily shelled the equipment. Drones attacked from the air, artillery fired at them, and then javelins hit them from all the sides. Russian tanks burned and exploded, and many Russian soldiers died in them and burned alive. According to Ukraine armed forces, only a couple of days, Ukrainians burned around 60-65 heavy tanks, and in total, about 200 pieces of equipment. Before this attack, the Russian artillery, it must be said, conducted massive artillery training, and during this training, interestingly, the position of the Russian artillery itself became known. Why? Because when a gun fires for a long time, being in one place, counter battery combat detects where the gun is, and a projectile immediately flies there in response. For the Ukrainian counter battery, on this day, or rather in the morning, when the Russians began a massive shelling of Avdiivka, dozens of these targets appeared in the form of Russian artillery guns, which in generally particularly didn't hide. Therefore, half of the Russian howitzers were destroyed by a long-range artillery strike in American HIMARS. An interesting story came out of this Tericon with this huge mountain of slag. Because on the very first day, Russian Z bloggers announced that this Avdiivka Terikon, which is a crucial position because it rises 100 meters above the surrounding steppe, was captured. This caused an attack of incredible joy and optimism in the circles of Russian quilters. However, it immediately became clear that the Russians were not on the Terikon but near it. And this, is a big difference, like standing on the castle wall or being under a castle wall. Because of this, they even had an internal conflict between those closer to the front line and those Russian Z bloggers who write their posts from Moscow. So, Moscow bloggers and news channels' report of what was happening were much more optimistic and triumphant. Those in the Donetsk region scold the Russian propaganda channels for writing overly optimistic things. And on Thursday, October 12th, in the evening, Russians started writing about the fact that they had recaptured Avdiivka Terikon, or in other words, artificial heights from the Ukrainian army at the cost of huge losses in heroism. And this morning, and next morning on Friday, the 13th, the same media channel said, "Oops, I'm sorry, Terikon was still not completely captured by Russians, and these positions were regained by Ukraine armed forces." So Russian propaganda is always full of lies and does its job perfectly to brainwash its population to cherish Putin. We're now approaching the moment when the Russian offensive will begin to wind down. It will be interesting to see if the Russian General Staff decides to bring its reserve into the battle. On the other hand, this is an almost suicidal move. It is unlikely that even the reserves will now be able to significantly change the situation and break through the Ukrainian defense forces. Russian politics and war strategies aim to ensure that war continues as long as they need, and that Vladimir Putin remains in power as long as possible. Well, what will this mean for Ukraine? First, it will mean that there will be probably no relief in the Avdiivka area soon. This is where the Russian forces concentrated, and Ukrainians should defend it. That is, the Russians will go ahead and for quite a long time. It must be understood that most likely the story will drag on even more if the Russian reserves are thrown there in huge quantities. Secondly, if Avdiivka is under Ukrainian control, if it's possible to hold out there, then the armed forces of Ukraine will have an excellent chance to conduct a successful counterattack in the area. But let's not forget, here's what Ukrainian armed forces are trying to accomplish. Do you remember what happened in Bakhmut? So basically, Ukraine armed forces just killed thousands of Russian soldiers. And this is another trap in Avdiivka when from those artificial heights, Ukrainians can mull over all the Russian force in order to weaken the enemy. So let's talk about the war in Israel and how the war in Israel can affect the supply of weapons from the United States. First of all, none of the officials involved in one way or another in making relevant decisions, both officially and unofficially, suggest the possibility that military aid to Ukraine will be stopped. Theoretically, such a possibility exists. Practically, no one has no one has said that this is likely, even in the case of, relatively speaking, Donald Trump's victory. In this case, this risk increases, but no one claims that this will happen. That is, there will be military aid. Second, will it decrease or will it involve certain pauses? So, this were clear even before the start of large scale hostilities on the territory of Israel, the Gaza Strip. This is connected with the elections campaign in the US, with the exploitation by the Trump wing of the Republican Party of the thesis about the unjustified aid to Ukraine. Therefore, unfortunately, a part of the voters of not only the Republicans but also the Democratic Party is inclined that aid to Ukraine should at least be reduced. Parts of the Republican Party, even moderate ones, are already more cautious in their attempts to protect this aid. The third is objective reason. Specific difficulties in the American state do not foresee a particular surplus of ammunition in warehouses and storage bases of the Pentagon. In a certain classification of ammunition, they do not have a surplus in certain types of weapons. To replenish their reserves, they need additional funds, which they cannot get yet. Since they currently have budget funding for defense on hold, it will be tough for them to meet our needs, which are not decreasing. That is objective. Further, if we are partners for the United States, then Israel is an ally. This is the first. Second, if the aid to Ukraine is the goodwill of the US, then, in the case of Israel, it is the international legal agreements that they must fulfill, regardless of the level of relations between Israel and the USA today, who leads Israel or the US. The third moment, the Middle East is a zone of US strategic interest, and Israel is the only reliable ally there. The US interests in the Middle East, let's face it, are much greater than in Ukraine, and Israel is an ally, and we are just partners. In view of this, in view of strained relations between China and Taiwan, it is clear that American lawmakers, politicians, authorities, and the military keep in mind the difficult situation and the need to increase the supply of arms to Israel and possibly to Taiwan. Therefore, it's clear that if the mechanism for increasing the production of equipment and ammunition is not launched, and this involves appropriate budget allocation, then it's clear that aid to Ukraine might decrease for objective reasons. For how much? It will depend on a huge number of factors: what the war in the Middle East will be like, how large scale it will be, at what range of weapons and armaments the Israelis will need, how much the US can restore, and how much the situation between China and Taiwan will escalate or, on the contrary, calm down. What losses in equipment and weapons, and in what types, will the armed forces undergo? What nomenclature will they primarily need? The primarily is that unfortunately no alternative to the structure of the state that would replace the US in supplying Ukraine with weapons and armaments. The European Union, with all due respect, and our other partners are unable to supply Ukraine with the quantity and the quality of a certain range of weapons, armaments, ammunition, equipment, and technical means that the United States can. We need to increase the production of our own ammunition. Unfortunately, we do not have much that can work in the conditions of war. This is an objective reason. But despite all that desire, currently neither the Ukrainian economy nor the Ukrainian defense industrial complex can fully satisfy the needs of the defense forces. The most effective and the most rational, pragmatic step is an attempt to create joint ventures. Our partners have already signed many contracts with Western weapon producers to start production of the weapons on the territory of Ukraine. On the other hand, we need to expand the number of countries that agree to supply us with weapons, armaments, various means, equipment. On the other hand, to increase our own. However, Ukraine has made some progress in that, specifically in 2023. The supply of weapons from the Allies might start decreasing, and Ukraine did its best to scale up its own production. We understand that Western military and financial aid will eventually decrease to a minimum. The Ukrainian President Zelensky office understands that and has been spending money from the budget and financial aid not only on purchasing weapons but also on the defense sector's development. One of these investments directions was the establishment of the drone army. So far, the government has allocated more than $1 billion to purchase and develop our drone models. We witnessed how the Ukrainian drone army changed the war dynamics over the years. Regarding Ukraine's weapon production, including drones, its speed was significantly increased with the newly established United Coordination Platform Brave One. This government platform, Brave One team, has developed the Defense Tech Industry Platform, which allows the government and private businesses to collaborate quickly and effectively to produce new types of weapons in a short period of time. The other direction was to set up our own shell and rocket production. In 2023, Ukraine signed several contracts with Western defense companies to produce 155 mm shells, rifles, bullets, and other weapons. Moreover, we'll start production of our own air defense systems with the help of our Western partners. So last week, Ukraine announced successful trial of long-range missile with up to 1,000 kilometer ranges. Mass production should start very soon, confirmed the president office. Moreover, for the first time since the start of the war, Ukraine's average number of projectiles launched exceeded that of Russian forces. As you know, due to sanctions, the Russian defense sector is struggling to make as many weapons as needed due to a lack of foreign components that were available for the Russians before the war. But instead, the Ukrainians has increased its production significantly. So, despite all the difficulties, the time might be working in our favor. Thank you for listening to my podcast. If you like it, please share with your friends.